He had the reputation of being cold and efficient, and then, in one exhausted midnight, he did the warmest thing anyone in that town would later try to explain. It was a contradiction that everyone noticed, but few could name. The rain had a rhythm like small percussion on the clinic awning, and his coat was still damp when he opened the back door to a figure who smelled of rain and perfume and something raw. Dr. Marcus Reed lived by shifts and protocols and a calendar full of unresolved charts. That night, he had Maya asleep on the couch at home and a stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. He invited the stranger into the treatment room for one exam and did not know at the time that she belonged to a family with rules that did not include doctors like him. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, offered a cup of tea, and in the quiet that followed, something fragile began to reconfigure inside both of them. What do you do when an act you think is small changes the path of more than one life? He did not know yet that the choice to help would ask him to choose again and again, and that every choice would demand more than medicine. The night smelled of wet asphalt, antiseptic, and old coffee. The fluorescent lights inside the clinic buzzed low and steady, a hum like a distant engine. Marcus walked with the slow, stitched gait of someone who had learned to move through pain without touching it. The stranger sat on the examination table wrapped in a borrowed hospital gown, her hair dark and plastered to her face, her voice thin. Marcus introduced himself in the same measured tone he used with anxious relatives and with people who expected miracles. He glanced at the clock, then at the sign that said no visitors after midnight and the photograph of the town taken from the river. A janitor named Tom knocked quietly to tell him the generator was keeping the building warm and then left a thermos of coffee by the nurse's station. The woman said her name was Aria and then stopped, as if stopping felt safer than explaining. He handed her a paper cup that warmed his palm and hers. The light on her collarbone flashed a small glint that looked like a coin but was only a scrap of broken charm. He thought of Maya and of the small bed waiting at home with a faded dinosaur sheet. He thought of duties and of mercy and decided, by degrees, to put his coat back on and offer the clinic as a place to wait out the storm. He was known as the coldest doctor because he never lingered with small talk, and because his compassion had a professional edge. Yet he took the case, writing notes and ordering tests, not because of the politics he suspected she might bring, but because someone sitting on a splintered examination table asked for a place to be warm. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol, of medicine, of the citrus cleaner Nurse Priya favored. Aria refused to show identification and was evasive about where she had been, but she could not hide the bruise on her forearm and the tremor in her hands. Marcus examined her quietly, fingers precise and practical, listening to the sound of her breathing, looking at the color under her eyes like one reads a patient chart. He asked simple questions and she answered hesitant fragments. In the lull between words, Maya called on his phone with a 3-second scream of laughter from the babysitter, and he felt the tug of ordinary life like a paperweight on his shoulder. He told Aria she could stay in the clinic hallway for a few hours and sleep in the recliner in the staff lounge. She said that would be enough for now and smiled in a way that was almost apologetic and almost brave. Backstory of Marcus unfolded slowly as neighbors and colleagues filled in the outlines like soft pencil strokes. He had grown up in a small housing block 3 streets over from the clinic where he now worked, the son of Rosa, who managed the bakery, and of Miguel, who repaired bikes at the corner shop. As a boy, he learned to mend scraped knees and tie shoelaces and to carry home the smell of yeast and coffee. He had been the first in his family to attend medical school, and he remembered the scholarship letter like a landmark in his pocket. He had arrived in the hospital with ambition folded into quiet, and somewhere along the way, the urgency of survival had hardened into a daily ritual of efficiency. His marriage had ended when Maya was 2, after nights of arguments about time and tiredness. He had kept the dentist appointment books and the small stuffed dinosaur Maya still preferred. He had a sister, Lena, who taught at the primary school, and a friend from residency named Alan who now ran the surgical unit. The life of service and the weight of bills and the small acts of kindness he performed for old neighbors had shaped him into someone who was precise with needles and clumsy with sentiment. The second layer of Marcus' history detailed his choices and losses in a paragraph that smelled like hospital soap and oversteeped tea. He had borrowed money to open a small weekend clinic to serve the people in his neighborhood and had watched as municipal funding drifted away. He had argued once in a manager's meeting with Mayor Thompson about preventative care and had been told the budget was tight and that his tone was too blunt. He held on to his integrity like a book held closed with both hands. And sometimes the book smelled faintly of despair and sometimes of hope. He had learned to protect Maya from the conversations adults had about unpaid rent, and yet there were nights his daughter had overheard him crying softly into his pillow. He had not planned to be remarkable. He had planned to be steady. The third paragraph of his backstory read like a medical chart of an emotional life that would be translated into choices later. He had been shaped by his father, Miguel, who had insisted that dignity was a task, that it came from showing up each morning and putting on your shoes even when your feet hurt. Rosa had baked bread for neighbors who could not afford to pay and never took credit. Marcus had taught himself to listen and to be present. The fracture came when his wife left and when he realized that time was a resource he could not purchase back. Maya became a compass needle, pointing him away from reckless risk and toward small sacrifices. Now, years later, and with a reputation for being cold, Marcus also carried the muscle memory of care and of knowing that sometimes being cold on the outside is the only way to stay warm enough to help others. The morning after the night in the clinic was a small domestic scene that nodded both humor and tenderness into the day. Maya dropped a cereal bowl on the floor, and the sound of crack against tile made a small crater in the quiet. They ate scrambled eggs and toast, and he burned his thumb trying to rescue a piece of bread for her. The kitchen smelled of eggs and black pepper, and of the lemon cleaner Lena recommended. Maya made a song about the dinosaur, and then asked if Arya could come over for pancakes if she wanted. He hesitated, the weight of choices heavy again, then agreed with a clipped voice that hid relief. He drove Maya to school, passing the bakery where Rosa was kneading dough and laughing with a customer named Lucy. He worked a full shift at the clinic, stitched a man named Harris who cut his hand on a broken bottle, and took a moment to fix a leaking faucet while talking to a nurse about community outreach. The clinic had a back room with a patient cot and a donated recliner from the thrift store, and that small space became a temporary harbor for Arya. The smell there was softer, like warm cotton and the residue of the herbal tea the receptionist Carla kept in the drawer. The early exchanges between Arya and Marcus in the staff lounge unfolded over 8 careful lines of dialogue as he tried to balance professional caution with human decency. Dialogue seen at the staff lounge went like this, in a slow and deliberate rhythm. Marcus asked, "Are you sure you do not want me to call someone?" Arya replied, "I do not want trouble." Marcus pressed, "What kind of trouble?" Arya answered, "My last name brings trouble." Marcus said, "You can tell me a little." Arya whispered, I am not from here, and I am not safe from my past." Marcus asked, "Do you have a phone?" Arya touched her pocket and said, "No, it was taken." Marcus offered, "There is coffee and a blanket and a place to sleep." Arya looked at him and said, "Thank you for that." Marcus nodded and said, "We will take this slowly." Arya smiled, a small, tired curve, and said, "I will be quiet." This exchange carried weight because the pauses were full and because the surveillance of the clinic meant rules, and still small kindness moved into the frame and set the next scenes in motion. Work and trial came quickly to test the quiet. Marcus returned to his shifts and found the clinic fuller than usual with people who needed stitches and with complaints about waiting lists at the hospital. He worked with Nurse Priya through a busy morning that smelled of disinfectant and the metallic tang of blood, And he instructed Carla on paperwork for a charity fund. He noticed a teenager named Jonah bringing in shoes donated by Rosa, and a teacher named Lena calling to ask about a school assembly on safety. A man named Detective Harris dropped by to ask routine questions about a minor assault in the park and mentioned the name that made Marcus narrow his eyes. Marcus had to balance empathy and boundaries. He gave Aria a volunteer application to sign and told her gently that if she wanted help finding a shelter, he would assist. She hesitated and then handed him a small scrap of paper with an address and the faintest ink of a name. He found himself buying her a pair of shoes from the thrift shop with money he had been saving for a new thermostat. He did not offer charity with the thinness of pity. He offered it like someone offering a hand to climb a fence. The first moment of real danger arrived one bright afternoon in the park, a scene saturated with sounds and tactile shock that demanded a sacrifice. Marcus had walked there after a double shift, his shoulders heavy with fatigue and the sun warm on his neck. He saw Aria by the public fountain, talking with a busker named Sam. And then a truck idled too close, and a man with a face like a weathered map began to shout a last name that belonged to a family Marcus recognized from news clippings. The air vibrated like a plucked string. Marcus felt his heart spike and then slow with calculation. He moved between them, and the man shoved him, and the shove knocked the wind from his chest, and he tasted pennies and grit. He heard Maya in his mind and thought of how small her hands were. He said, "Calm down," to the man, and the man spat, "You must not touch my daughter." Marcus answered, "I am not looking to create trouble," and the man hissed, "You do not know who she is." Marcus held his ground, and the busker Sam called 911. The scuffle was brief, and the police arrived, and Detective Harris wrote a report. The moment left Marcus with a knot in his jaw and a bruise on his ribs that would throb for a week. The town would later call it a hero move, and the family would later call it an intrusion. For Marcus, it was a decision like any other, to stand in the gap. The discovery of the small charm on Aria changed the stakes. It was found when she misplaced it in the clinic kitchen, a tiny gold pendant shaped like a crest and engraved with initials that matched a name Marcus had once seen in the society pages. The pendant smelled faintly of perfume and of the lemon cleaner, and when he held it, it felt warm. He ran his thumb over the engraving and thought of how people kept secrets attached to jewelry. He asked Aria about it, and she laughed, a brittle sound, and said, "My family would never let me keep this if they knew where I was." Marcus asked, "Where did you get it?" And she said, "An old friend gave it to me," and then stayed silent. The revelation pulled a thread that tugged at him and at the community, and the figures of power began to orbit closer. There were 8 exchanges between Marcus and Aria in which she admitted to being the daughter of a man named Dalton Pierce, and that she had left an arranged engagement and had been trying to disappear for a little while. Marcus listened and checked the file, and the clinic fridge hummed a low note like a soundtrack to tension. He could have paid attention only as a doctor. Instead, he saw the human on the other side and felt the net of social rules tighten. Confrontation with power arrived in a fluorescent corridor and a voice that smelled like expensive cologne. Dalton Pierce came to the clinic with a retinue and a lawyer and a camera phone held by a reporter named Lucy who smelled like warm toast and ink. He was not a friendly man, and he spoke with an assumption of rights. He asked in a voice pitched low, "Why is my daughter here?" And Marcus answered, "We are only offering medical care and shelter." Dalton said, "She is off limits," and he brought a document and said, "You will not involve the press." Marcus met him with a directness that some called blunt and said, "She sought help." Dalton countered, "Do you know what you are doing?" Marcus replied, "I know how to care for a human being." Arya stood between them and looked like someone about to step from one cliff to another. The tension built like pressure in a vein. The argument spilled into the parking lot where neighbors gathered, including Rosa and Miguel and Lena and Sam. There were voices that accused and voices that defended. Marcus had 8 to 10 exchanges with Dalton in which choice after choice edged him toward a simple question about rights and safety. Dalton insisted on control, and Marcus insisted on autonomy, and in the end, Arya chose to leave with Dalton for reasons that broke the small-shaped piece of his chest. The departure left a silence that felt like a room without furniture. Arya left with a white SUV and a fast smile that did not reach her eyes. The town felt smaller and colder. Marcus returned to his routines and found them altered. Maya asked in the kitchen why did she go, and he tried to explain with an economy of words and a tenderness he was often too careful to use. He said she felt it was safer, and Maya frowned and asked, "Is safer always kind?" Marcus hesitated and remembered the sound of the truck in the park and the way the charm had looked like a map to other lives. He sat up late and wrote notes and then burned the coffee and spilled a small amount of sugar on the counter and felt many small things like stings on his skin. Weeks later, there was a crisis. Maya fell ill with a fever that made her small body ache, and Marcus felt the world tilt. He rushed her to the hospital emergency room, and the machines hummed, and the antiseptic was a bright, sharp note. She needed an IV and an overnight stay and a test that carried a price. And in that moment, Marcus realized how thin the line was between professional care and the price of dignity. A moment of tension unfolded in the hospital corridor when bills and choices collided. A social worker named Carla told him that the clinic had limited funds and that insurance might not cover the tests. Marcus felt the old familiar weight of responsibility and an anger that tasted bitter. He confronted the billing office with a bluntness that felt like a splinter being pulled. He said, "We need to prioritize care," and the clerk said, "We have rules," and Marcus said, "Those rules are killing people." The exchange lasted 3 minutes, but it felt like a year. A donor named Mayor Thompson heard about the dispute and called in a favor. The town murmured, and a small group of neighbors rallied to help pay for Maya's tests. Arya learned of Maya's hospitalization and without fanfare sent a message through Nurse Priya asking if there was anything she could do. Marcus read the message with a hardened face and then sat at the foot of Maya's bed and realized that decisions are rarely single acts and often come threaded with second chances. The second reveal was tender and complicated. Arya returned one late afternoon with a small paper bag containing a sandwich and a note that said, "I am sorry for leaving the way I did." She had a bruise that had faded to lavender on her jaw and an expression that suggested she had been to several rooms and decided which door to open. Marcus asked, "Why did you come back?" And she said, "Because I heard about Maya and because you were kind enough to be where others were not." Marcus asked, "Do you know what you are asking for?" And she said, "I am asking for a place to be without judgment." They argued softly about pride and exile, and there were 8 long exchanges where each line carried history and fear and the sound of vending machines in the corridor. In the end, Marcus offered to help Arya find a shelter and to arrange some legal aid. Arya answered, "I do not want to hide," and Marcus said, "Then we work together on something better." The confrontation with Dalton escalated when the press smelled a story and the charity records were subpoenaed. Dalton hired a lawyer and sent a cease and desist, and Arya was forced to make an impossible choice. The moment of crisis played out in 2 short paragraphs that pulsed with memory and decision. She remembered a childhood lesson about choosing safety over happiness, and she remembered the time she had run barefoot through a garden to escape a life someone else chose for her. She decided to leave with a plan that included a phone call to Detective Harris and to ask for witness protection help. Marcus sat in his car afterward, and the rain began to fall again, and he thought about how small acts had summoned large consequences. The community leaned in. Rosa baked a batch of cinnamon rolls and delivered them to the clinic. Miguel offered to repair the clinic door pro bono. Lena organized a small fundraiser at the school, and Sam played a set in the square to gather donations. Lucy, the reporter, wrote a piece that was careful and kind, highlighting the dignity of the people who had helped. The clinic received letters and a modest anonymous donation, and Marcus found himself in the middle of a network he had always served and that was now serving him. Arya, with Marcus and with the help of Detective Harris and Nurse Priya, applied for a safe house and legal aid. She began to volunteer at Rosa's bakery, learning to tie pastry with a nervous grace and the smell of butter and sugar around her fingers. She and Maya met and learned to share pancakes and then to share small jokes about dinosaur beds and spilled syrup. Their relationship was not simple. It had edges where fear returned and nights when sleep would not come. But there was also laughter that sounded like repairs being made. A moment of tension came when Dalton attempted to revoke Arya's access to funds that supported a small scholarship she had once set up and which now helped the clinic. The fight was legal and public, and it required a different kind of courage from Marcus. He stood in a hearing room and spoke plainly about the value of community health and about the dignity of people whose lives are measured in small acts. His testimony included technical details about budgets and outreach and the human stories of the patients who relied on the clinic. The legal team included a volunteer lawyer named Alan and a paralegal named Priya, and the hearing lasted all day. Marcus felt fatigue like weights on his shoulders, but he also felt an energy that was not his alone. The judge ruled in favor of the clinic, and the scholarship remained intact. The victory was small and large at the same time. It bought the clinic another season of services and granted Arya a margin of safety. The final block was the slow unwinding into a future that bore tangible signs of change. The epilogue unfolded across 3 moments in time and threaded together the outcomes of choices with concrete detail. 1 month later, Arya was working part-time at Rosa's bakery and had enrolled in a night class at the community college. The smell of yeast and cinnamon clung to her jacket, and she carried a small notebook where she sketched pastry ideas between customers. Maya had started a drawing club at school, and Marcus had hung a framed photograph of the clinic staff in the lobby. The clinic had new brochures and a small sign that said, "Open Hearts, Open Hands," and there was an updated donation jar with a sticker that read, "For Community Care." The neighbors had painted a mural on the side of the clinic depicting hands and a river and a sunrise. Marcus found a letter from a former patient thanking him for a stitch that had allowed someone to return to work and for the dignity he had shown in a small exchange. He kept the letter folded in his wallet next to a picture of Maya smiling with a chocolate smudge on her cheek. 3 months later, the clinic had stabilized its funding through a combination of small grants and the ongoing support of local businesses and individuals. Mayor Thompson convened a meeting with the city council and agreed to prioritize community health for the next budget cycle. Arya completed a mediation workshop and started volunteering as an advocate for women seeking to leave controlling family situations. She had a new phone and a cheap set of keys that jingled like a new rhythm. Marcus taught a workshop on emergency care basics at the community center, and his sister Lena guest lectured about childhood development. The town school invited the clinic for a health fair, and there were booths and free checkups, and Rosa handed out free rolls to anyone who came. Marcus found a quiet pride in seeing Maya hand out food to neighbors and then run to the playground, her laughter like a bell. 6 months later, the change settled into ordinary life. The clinic had a small expansion thanks to a fundraising campaign led by Lucy and Miguel and Sam, and the addition of a part-time social worker named Carla, whose presence eased the paperwork that used to choke the staff. Marcus had a new worn coat and a pair of shoes that did not squeak, and he and Arya had developed a friendship that was careful and deepening and not yet named. They shared shifts, helping people who arrived with weather-battered faces and with stories that required both first aid and listening. Arya had saved enough to rent a small studio and had begun an apprenticeship at a local culinary school. She and Maya sometimes baked together and left extra cinnamon rolls in the clinic staff room as a private offering of thanks. The clinic bulletin board showed before and after photographs of repaired lives and a list of community partners. Marcus and Arya once stood on the clinic stoop late at night, the town asleep and the street lamps humming, and they counted small victories like coins in a jar. Marcus said, "I never thought I would be called warm," and Arya laughed and said, "Maybe you were always warm under the armor." The story ended not with a miraculous rescue, but with a series of small transformations that accumulated into something durable. The clinic was not wealthy, but it was steadier. Maya had a new after-school program and her drawings filled a corridor. Arya had a legal advocate and a job and friends who would answer the phone at 3 in the morning. The town had learned again that dignity is not a privilege reserved for the few, but a practice available to anyone willing to act. People named names in thanks and in history, and the pendant that once signaled another life remained in a small velvet box in a drawer, a reminder that identity can be both a burden and a refuge. If you have ever been touched by an ordinary kindness that shifted your path, share it below, starting with "one small gesture that changed my day," so we can collect moments that remind us of what keeps a community alive. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more stories of second chances and real people who choose to care. In the end, Marcus kept his careful ways and learned to let his edges soften in certain places, and the village learned that the warmest acts sometimes come from the hands that others called the coldest.